Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Greg. I'm the product manager for ComponentOne here at Meshes. In this CodeClinic, I'm going to be giving a Masterclass introductory demo to the industry's most trusted C#.NET Datagrid, FlexGrid. I'm going to cover most of the key features and all of the critical parts of the API that you'll need to build your WinForms apps. Today's demos will take about 30 minutes, plus I have some feature slides along the way. With today's CodeClinic, you'll discover how FlexGrid can replace or significantly enhance your WinForms data grid. You'll gain a clear understanding of the full range of FlexGrid's powerful features. You'll see key features in action, including cell customization, data operations, and performance optimization. And you'll pick up practical tips and best practices along the way to help you get started and quickly shorten your onboarding time. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them, and we'll take a look at the end. Also, if you stay to the end, you'll get the instructions on how to win a free license of ComponentOne WinForms Edition. So if you've done any WinForms development, you'll probably know the Datagrid view component. It's the standard .NET Datagrid control. So for basic applications, this control gets the job done. It does come with many limitations and pain points when developing with it, though. And that's where the ComponentOne FlexGrid comes in. It's a third-party data grid control. It supports the entire .NET stack. The main areas where FlexGrid shines versus Datagrid View are in its customization. So FlexGrid supports many more built-in customizable features that you can enable with minimal code. Its extensibility. So when you do need to write a bit more code to customize the grid to your liking, FlexGrid has such a rich API. It has all the hooks and classes that you need to implement any custom use case that you can imagine, with still minimal code compared to the Datagrid view and most other third-party data grids. Third, its performance. So FlexGrid's API not only gives you options to focus on performance over certain features, but we have some performance-specific features themselves, like virtual mode, where data can be loaded on demand. And also, migration is easy and straightforward, as the data binding and the cell editing features carry forward from the Datagrid view. But also migration can apply to expanding beyond WinForms if you want to scale to, say, WPF or WinUI, even Blazor and Maui, and even JavaScript. We have a FlexGrid available on all of these other more modern platforms as well. So if we take a look at the features side by side, the Datagrid view and FlexGrid support similar data binding and editing features, like automatic cell sizing, column and row freezing. And aside from sorting, though, FlexGrid supports many more of these data analysis features like grouping and filtering, hierarchical displays, on-demand virtualization, and even some advanced displays like transposed view, multi-line rows, column bands. The additional benefit of having other libraries with the ComponentOne edition, like Excel export and themes, also add a lot of value to FlexGrid compared to Datagrid view. For a lot more information on this analysis comparing the FlexGrid to the Datagrid view, you can check out this article I wrote on medium.com. It's called The Definitive Guide to WinForms Data Grids. You could just search the title or scan this QR code. But now on to some coding demos. So here are all the features that I'm going to cover in this CodeClinic. So data binding, transposed views, conditional formatting, grouping, searching, virtual mode, print preview, export. So buckle up. So naturally, the first feature I will cover is working with data. So just like the .NET Data Grid view, FlexGrid allows you to connect the grid to almost any data source, like a data table, a collection of objects, or even link queries. You can also, of course, connect a SQL Server or any of the other online CRMs that we support through the ComponentOne data connectors. But what's interesting and unique about FlexGrid is that it can also be used in unbound scenarios, meaning you can just manually add the rows and columns and get and set the cell text for every individual cell. And that really just unlocks like the full extent of the customization that's possible. Now, the first demo we'll walk through is adding the control to the toolbox, adding some unbound cells, and then we'll show the data binding and what can be achieved at design time. So let's start working here with FlexGrid in Visual Studio. Here I have a .NET 9 Windows Forms C# application. And first thing you're going to have to do is add the FlexGrid NuGet package, c1.win.flexgrid. But once you have that package added to your project, you can find the component in the toolbox, and then you can just drag and drop it to the form, just like you do any other control. And what's nice about FlexGrid is that the design time experience is really grand. We have the smart tag, we have designer editors, but of course you can always just work with the property grid over on the right to find all the properties you want to set. Now this smart tag elevates some of these key features like adding rows, data binding, deleting rows, editing, column reordering, and even column filtering. So I'm going to go ahead and enable column filtering here, and we'll take a look at that in a bit. Now, by default, FlexGrid has some unbound rows and columns already added to the grid here. Now, these would get cleared out when we data bind, but before we get to that, let's work with this unbound scenario. So at design time, FlexGrid has this column designer here. If you click on designer, and here you can set all the properties per column. So you can enable the filtering and the editing, the dragging, all those types of things at a column level. The header is actually called caption in this case. So we're going to set the caption for one of these columns here to just say column 1. And then after this, we can just go ahead and build and run the app, and we'll see what it looks like with this unbound situation. So you'll see here, we can just start editing the cells at runtime. You can navigate through the cells using tab and enter. But we also get all the other Datagrid features as well. Like we can like resize the columns, we can sort and filter, reorder the columns, and so on. But now let's see how we could also get and set the cell values in code. The key API that you're going to want to learn to use is this bracket syntax right here, like bracket, column, comma, row. And that allows you to get and set the cell values throughout the entire grid. So here I'm just going to set this first cell here to say hello FlexGrid. Now this really gives you that fine-grained control and is great for these small data sets, or if you're building up the grid programmatically. You can also add rows and columns using the rows and calls collections to fully create a custom unbound grid. But now let's move on to data binding. In my demo here, I've already written this load data method that will connect to a Northwind OData service using ComponentOne data connectors, naturally. And this will load the products data and fill a data set or a data table. And then I'm just going to set that to a regular old .NET binding source, just like I would if I was binding to the Datagrid view. Now, .NET Core has some limited design time for data binding, so it helps to create an object class to represent your data if you want to work in design time, and that's what I did here. So I created this object binding source just using the Visual Studio add a new object data source here. Now, I've already created it just to save some time, but once I set the FlexGrid's data source to the product binding source, you'll see all the columns get automatically generated. But what's great is that we can still customize these columns at design time without breaking the binding. So we could go in here, we could reorder, I can rename these columns, and it'll stick. So let's rename this one from product name to just name, just so we can see some change at runtime. And it's neat that FlexGrid's design time experience makes this possible to see the changes right here in the designer. So I guess we can go ahead and build and rerun this. All right, so now we see our products are loaded. The product name column still says name. We can go ahead and test out these other features like the sorting. And let's do column reordering. And let's take a look at this column filtering. So this built-in column filtering is a very powerful feature like Microsoft Excel. You get this without having to write any code. So your users can filter by the cell value or create multiple conditions like greater than, equals, and so on. So at this point, we've seen two ways to work with FlexGrid: unbound setting cells, data binding to quickly populate the grid with our business data. And together, these give us that full range of flexibility from simple spreadsheets to complex data views. Now, let's go a little deeper into some column and row features. Now, these are those small and powerful touches that make working with data much smoother, both for you as the developer and for the end users. So first up, auto sizing. So auto sizing the columns and rows makes any ordinary data grid just look and feel 10 times better when the user can see all of the cell text values. Freezing columns pins those columns to the left or those rows to the top for quick and easy access as the user scrolls. Also a very quick feature to enable. And with transposed views, instead of showing the records as rows, we can flip the grid so the records are displayed as columns across the top. So let's jump back over to the demo. Now you might have noticed and wondered about this hot reload button you see here on my app. Now for many of these features I'm going to demonstrate, I tried to save some time building the app. So I put them inside this method that I can just call at runtime and take advantage of Visual Studio's hot reload feature for WinForms. But first, let me reorder this column before we run this. And here I'm adding the auto size calls method. And what that's going to do is automatically size the columns based upon their contents. So you're going to see the small columns get small, the bigger columns get bigger. But now if your data is coming in asynchronously, as it most likely will, you're going to want to call this auto size calls method after the data refreshes, or perhaps some event from your view model. So for this, FlexGrid has the after data refresh event. So here I'm going to listen to this event and move my auto size calls method down there. That way, when I build and rerun this, this will be better, not just hot reloaded. Next, let's move on to column freezing. So FlexGrid has a columns collection, and that columns collection has a frozen property. So all we have to do is set that to the number of columns we want frozen. And that's it. Now we can hot reload this one. And there we have it. With frozen columns, they remain in view as the user scrolls. And we could set a similar property to freeze the rows at the top as well. And now let's move on to transposing, or we're going to flip the rows and columns. FlexGrid has one property you have to set here, and it's just called transposed. So we set it to true, it's a Boolean property. But you also want to set the auto size rows and columns methods just to refresh the view, especially in my situation, hot reloading this, just to make the data look really nice. And you can play around with these settings. I'm also going to unfix one of the columns just to make it look nice. And you'll see this in your own experience. So look at that. So all the rows are now spanning across horizontally, and our column headers are now going down the left. Now what's neat about this is that you can still sort and filter the transposed grid. And this view could be useful if you want to analyze data or present it from a different angle with a more readable layout. But now for the rest of the demo, I'm not going to be using this transposed view. So I'm going to go ahead and comment that back out. But now this is just the beginning of FlexGrid's flexibility. Next, we're going to look at 3 powerful customization options for the cells: cell styles, conditional formatting, and custom editors. So with cell styles, at the most basic level, you can apply styles to change the fonts and the colors and the alignment. You could then apply a cell to an individual cell, or you can apply a style to an individual cell or an entire row or an entire column, or really any custom range you want. Now, with conditional formatting, we're essentially taking a cell style and applying it to a cell based upon its value. And FlexGrid not only supports this type of custom cells, but also custom cell editors per column and per individual cell. So now let's take a look at this. To begin working with cell styles, we start in the designer. FlexGrid has a styles collection editor right from the smart tag. And on the left here, you can see all the different built-in cell styles for things like frozen cells, hover, alternate row. I'm going to set the fixed cell back color to some different color, just so that our white headers stand out from the cells. Give it a bit more of a contrast for that traditional data grid look. So we'll just choose this green. And let's also change the alternating row style. That always looks nice in some pictures. So we'll set this to just another light green color. And unfortunately, the stuff that I change here in the designer, I can't hot reload. So we have to build and rerun the application. And there we have our style. So now, what if we want to create a cell style for a custom range of cells? We can do that. We can create it in the designer and then apply it in code, or we could create the whole thing in code. So if you saw back in the styles collection editor, let me see if I can show this here. Back in the styles collection editor, there is an add button. So what we could do is we could add that there and then work with it in code. But for this, let me just show you how to create the whole thing in code. Not only create the custom style, but also the syntax to modify the built-in ones. So in code here, we use the FlexGrid.styles collection. And then we reference each style by its name, as you can see here. So I'm adding this custom style called my custom style. And then we have access to the cell style API. So things like the back color, the font, the border, and so on. And then most importantly, we set the set cell style method that applies it to a custom range of cells. So here I'm going to create this custom style with a red background. And I'm just going to set it to the 7th cell in the grid here. So as you can see, this is just this red header cell. But now you can probably see where this is going. We want to apply this style to certain cells based on their value. And we call this conditional formatting. For instance, maybe we want to apply this style to all the cells that have a value of 0 to highlight these values to the user. Now for this, FlexGrid has a very useful event called owner_draw_cell. The owner_draw_cell event, this is fired every time a cell is drawn, and it gives you that flexible control over customizing the cell's appearance, formatting, and so much. But to enable this event, we also have to set the draw mode property to owner_draw. That basically tells FlexGrid, hey, use the owner_draw. And then down in the owner_draw_cell event, and I'm also going to be calling this invalidate method just for my hot reload, but you will not. Invalidate basically forces FlexGrid to refresh. But down in this owner_draw_cell event, we pass in this parameter that tells us which cell is being drawn and the cell value. And from here, we can easily write some evaluation to determine if the cell should be formatted with the custom cell style. So here, if the column is units in stock and the value is 0, we apply the style, or else we set the style back to default. Now this is important so that your cells will update after editing, because if the user edits the cell, we want it to not be read anymore and switch back to something else if the value is correct, of course. So here we can see all of these red cells now for my units in stock. Now if I edit one of these to something other than 0, the default cell style should be applied. Aha. Now, that brings me on to the next topic, which is custom cell editors. By default, FlexGrid supports several special editors based on the data type. So here you can see checkboxes are used for Booleans. It may not be as obvious, but even for the numeric columns, there is a special numeric editor being used, something that prevents the user from entering in alphabet letters. So I can't type, I can only type numbers in to these number columns. So FlexGrid lets you customize which editor is used per column. And this is useful for precise control over which cell editor you want to use. So for here, we're going to set the units in stock column to use the numeric up-down control. And also show buttons when editing means it will show buttons from the control. So here now that I've hot reloaded this, when I edit one of these numeric fields, we'll see the little numeric up-down button right there. But now, as one of the great features of FlexGrid is its flexibility. So of course, we can customize the editor per cell too. And this is actually handled through the cell style, because the cell style also has an editor property. So here what I'm going to do is create another custom control, a custom dropdown that I'll apply to my cell style. So let's say we have some stored procedure that once the inventory reaches 0, we want the user to launch some stored procedure by a button click and not just edit the value. So here we're going to add in this custom dropdown that just has a button that says reload inventory. And this custom cell editor will only apply to the cells that have the my custom style. So essentially, if units in stock is 0, that cell gets this editor. Otherwise, it'll get the regular editor. So let's find one of these values that has there. And you'll see here, there's a little drop-down button with the button that says reload inventory. And of course, this could be anything imaginable. Now, this isn't going to be a webinar about custom drop-down control, but this really shows what you can do with the custom editors, showcasing the flexible nature of FlexGrid. Now, there's a lot more we can do with owner draw. For instance, we can show progress bars, percentages, draw icons alongside the text, even apply gradient backgrounds. The grid basically passes you the cell rectangle and cell data, and from there you can use standard GDI drawing calls to paint whatever you like. But there's more. ComponentOne, WinForms edition, also includes a component library called the Rules Manager. This provides a complete UI solution for your end users to create their own conditional formatting rules, just like Microsoft Excel. And of course, it integrates seamlessly with FlexGrid. Next, let's move on to another tentpole feature here, and that is grouping. So FlexGrid is not just limited to flat tables. It also supports a range of hierarchical display features to help you organize and explore complex data sets. So let's walk through some of these main options before I dive back to the code. First, what you're seeing here is grouping and subtotals. So you can group the rows by one or more columns. It's a pretty standard Datagrid feature. FlexGrid will automatically create these collapsible group headers. You can optionally have the grouping panel. You can also display subtotals like averages or sums directly, for each group, for each column. And this is great for financial reports or category-based data. Next is the row details feature. Now, this allows you to create a truly hierarchical display where you can expand a row to show additional information. Maybe it's hierarchical information. Maybe it's just additional fields. Like maybe the data grid, you only want to display 10 columns in the data grid, and maybe you have 20 other columns. You could put them expanded down into an input panel type layout. That way it keeps the main grid light and less cluttered. And if you have a hierarchical data situation, you could actually nest a child FlexGrid here to create that nested data grid. Next, we have the tree grid. Now, when we talk about tree grids with FlexGrid, we don't just mean grouping or row details. We mean FlexGrid's tree API that allows you to essentially flexibly build your own tree view from essentially any data set. So the way this works is that each row object has a node property, or each row could be turned into a node. And then you can customize the depth of the node, customize the tree lines and the icons. So the data doesn't even have to be hierarchical, but you can make it hierarchical. So it truly gives you this, unlocks anything imaginable. Whatever your data is, you can make it look like you want it to. And you essentially get the features of a tree view plus the data grid features like multiple columns, sorting, export, and so on. So it's not a traditional tree view. It's like a tree grid. And we have column bands. So when you think of hierarchical data grids, you might also be thinking of grouping the columns. Now, it may not necessarily be truly hierarchical, but it does make complex data easier to read and provides a cleaner visual structure. And as a bonus with column bands, you can also create multi-line rows with FlexGrid. This is where essentially you get multiple rows per row, if that makes sense. Now here for my demo, I'm going to show how to implement the grouping and the row details. So grouping can be done without any extra libraries, but if you want the grouping panel, you need to add the c1.win.flexgrid.group panel NuGet package to your project. This will add that component to your toolbox, which then you can just find it, C1 FlexGrid group panel, and drag it to your form. Now I'm going to have to sort of reconfigure the UI a little bit here because I want this to be docked at the top. I think I've determined the fastest way to do this is to then set the FlexGrid's order to be forward, and then that'll fix that. Yep. Now, the key property on the group panel that you're going to want to set is the FlexGrid property that will connect it to the data grid. So this only works with FlexGrid. And we can set other properties here, like the text that you see there. That's kind of like the placeholder text. We'll say like drag a column here. And then we can also set the style properties. Like maybe this white doesn't really match our theme anymore. So I'll set this to some gray color. All right, there we go. Now we can build and run this and see what the grouping looks like without writing any code. And of course, this is being delivered to the end user for them to group. So we can group here by supplier. We can group by multiple fields like category as well. We can still sort. But one thing you'll notice over here on the left, there's this text that's being cut off. This is like the group header text essentially, and it's already counting my items. It's cut off, but this is easy to fix. It's because the first column is just not very wide. FlexGrid has cell merging, so all we have to do is enable cell merging on FlexGrid. It's probably turned off by default for performance reasons, but we're going to turn this. And there's so many different options you can allow the merging to work out. We want it to just work for nodes, so we're going to set that just to nodes. And you can play around with all the merging features as well. Now, when we rebuild this and we group again, you can see now the text is no longer cut off. Now, this is good if you want your users to control the grouping. But if you, as the developer, want to establish this grouping in code, here's how you're going to do it. FlexGrid supports grouping in a pretty standard .NET way with the group descriptions collection. You basically just add a group description to the list with the column name. But what makes FlexGrid even better in this case is the easy customization of the group header text here. So here you can use this format to sort of change the way that the text is displayed in the group header row. Another feature that makes FlexGrid special is the aggregation. By just setting the column's aggregate property, we can tell FlexGrid to automatically sum, count, or average all of the values within each group for that column. So here we're going to sum the unit price and units in stock columns. And then when I reload this, we're going to see how the aggregate gets added to those columns. And of course, I could format that with currency. That's trivial. The column has a format property, format string. Okay, so another hierarchical feature I want to show quickly is the row details feature. FlexGrid provides built-in support for input panel and nested FlexGrid row details with just one line of code. And these are all part of the c1.win row details package with just one line of code. I'm going to enable the input panel because my products is not hierarchical. I'm just going to show the input panel here. When I hot reload this, we're going to see how an input panel gets added to each row details bound to my record data object, basically just duplicating all the fields. But with some customization, you could see how we could move some columns from either the data grid to the input panel, so forth. We could customize the input panel to be multiple columns. There's more we can do here with the right amount of time and with still minimal code. And like I said, FlexGrid also supports hierarchical data binding. So if our data source supports it, we can automatically just display a nested FlexGrid in there. But let's move on. The next powerful feature we want to look at is filtering. So FlexGrid supports several approaches to filtering. We already saw the built-in column filters, and that provides conditional and value-based filters instantly without writing any code. But what if you just want a clean and simple search box? That's pretty easy. FlexGrid makes it super easy to do that with one line of code. So let's just quickly add that. Really shows I think the more modern way that people like to search these days. So back in design time, what I'm going to have to do here is configure this for a search box. So I'm going to add a text box, a regular text box and a button to my form. And this may not be the best UI. I'm just going to put this on top of the grouping panel. And we'll have this button say search, just so it's pretty clear. And then I'm going to wire it up to an event that I already have prepared for speed here. And then we're going to go look at that. So to search FlexGrid with one line of code, we're going to use the apply search method. With this method, you basically just pass in the string you're searching and then the highlight mode. The highlight mode says, hey, do you want to highlight all the instances? Do you want to highlight just the first one? So let's build and run this, see what this looks like. I remember seeing the word queso in there. And there we go. So you can see the results are filtered and highlighted. So the apply search method also has additional parameters. So we could pass in, do we want it to be filtered or do we just want to highlight? That's one of the parameters. Also, we could get out of it the count. So if we want to maybe have like a label somewhere that says how many results were found, we could get that out of the apply search method. And we can also change the style. Of course, it's yellow here. Let's change it to pink, the highlight color. Oh, and I need to go and add this label to my form. That way I can display it. We'll just add something quick here at the bottom that will display the total search results. So I'm going to rename this. Now you could add a button to clear the search, or you can actually just, if you just search again with an empty string, it like clears the apply search. So there we go. You can see the pink text and you can see the total 23 at the bottom. So ComponentOne also has this nifty UI component called Data Filter UI. And this provides a rich set of filter buttons and input controls on the side of your app, or you can put it in a pop-up. And the data filter could work with any data-bound control, not just FlexGrid. Now, let's shift gears here a bit, and now let's talk about performance optimization. So I think we've seen enough features now in this demo to maybe understand what some of the performance bottleneck issues may be. So FlexGrid is by nature a fast component, but you can get even better results if you load, render, and update the data with a few simple habits. And I've highlighted a few of them here. And we have topics in the documentation and blogs that go into these a bit more as well, but let's look at these ones. So here, the first tip here I have is batching the UI updates between these begin init and end init calls. This ensures FlexGrid only calculates its layout once and not many times as you're setting up the grid and doing a million things to it. Second tip here is to defer auto-sizing the rows and columns until after the data is loaded. This one I pointed out earlier in my demo, but there's the FlexGrid after data refresh event, which is a good place to auto-size the rows rather than doing it earlier, because then as data gets added, it's resizing. Third, rendering. Since rendering is often a bottleneck, there are a few things we want to do with cell styles and owner draw. So for cell styles, it's best to keep them simple or minimal. If you have a ton of cell styles, that could certainly, naturally, slow down any component. Now for the owner draw event, because I mentioned that fires for every cell, so we do want to be smart when we're using it. So if you're applying conditional styles and things, you're going to want to make sure you're caching those things so they're not being recreated and disposed of for every single cell. And also you want to avoid things like string formatting and image decoding in there, because those are some of the most expensive things you can do. Now, when working with large data sets, one of the quick and easy solutions is called deferred scrolling or delayed scrolling. It's kind of like an illusion of performance where FlexGrid does not update drawing the cells until after the user stops scrolling. And it prevents the grid from repainting every pixel as you move down the grid. FlexGrid can handle a million rows on most machines, but if your data is extremely large, let's say multiples of millions of rows or more, the solution, the performance optimization solution at that point is often going to be handled at the data level. And there's two common solutions we go to for that. They're known as paging. That's essentially splitting the data into pages and you're just pulling down one page at a time, or virtual mode. Now, virtual mode works the same way as paging, but through the illusion of scrolling. Now, FlexGrid cannot do either of these things on its own. We need the help of like a data layer component. And that's where our C1 data collection comes into play. So for my demo here, we're going to take a look at the virtual mode, but also I'm going to quickly show the batch UI updates and the deferred scrolling in my existing project. So up here in my update FlexGrid method, where I'm doing all of this stuff to FlexGrid, I'm going to throw in my begin init method call at the beginning. You would do that at the beginning. And then at the end, you have to make sure it kind of like freezes the FlexGrid and says stop, don't draw until we tell it to end. Now I have this refresh here, but it might actually complicate things and, essentially cause a whole second cycle to happen, but that's only there for my hot reload. I could possibly remove it now, but we'll just keep that there. Also, I want to here add the deferred scrolling, and we can enable this with just one property on the scroll options equals scroll options equals delayed scroll. So let's go ahead and build and run this. Now in this demo, we probably won't see any noticeable benefit from the begin and end initialization, but we can see the deferred scrolling in action. So you'll see here as I scroll, FlexGrid does not move until I stop the scroll thumb. So it's kind of this illusion of performance. So if the grid was chugging along, you could add this in and the user wouldn't complain as much. So to show you the virtual mode feature, I'm going to jump over to a sample from our data collection library. Here we can see we're setting FlexGrid's data source to a special virtual mode data collection through a C1 data collection binding list. And also notice I have a package reference here to the C1 data collection and C1 binding list. But now the real magic here happens in the get page async method, which is over in this collection class. This is where you make your paged call to your data service. And that's how the data is actually loaded in pages asynchronously. Now, when running this, we'll be able to see the virtual mode in action. We can scroll the grid really, really fast and observe how the cells appear empty until we stop scrolling. Now, FlexGrid is doing some of the work here, notifying the collection of its position in the data set, so it knows how large the data set is and knows how to draw the scroll thumbs. Now, you can find this demo along with more in our data services library. A final big topic I want to cover today is printing and exports, because most likely you're going to want to add some of these features to your app that lets the users interact with Microsoft Excel or export to a variety of formats like HTML, PDF, CSV. The ComponentOne WinForms edition also makes it really easy to print with a complete print preview library that can be used in conjunction with FlexGrid. So back in design view, let me go ahead and first add a menu option here to print, because we don't want to just print when I run the app. That might be weird. So we're going to first put a button here that just says print. And then I'm first going to show the native, what I call the native built-in printing support for FlexGrid, which can be done with just one line of code. And that is the print grid. With the print grid method, there's a parameter to tell the printing how to fit the FlexGrid to the page. So I always like to fit it to the page width. That means all the columns are squished into one page. I always hate it when the columns break into multiple pages. And also there's a parameter for showing this print preview. Now this is the built-in one that's just using the standard print document, I believe. Very basic looking, hasn't been updated in a while. Of course, we can print from here. Now, the ComponentOne library also includes a much more rich and modern looking print preview experience in our printing library. So for this, you're going to want to add the NuGet package to c1.win.printing. Let me also comment out that. So yeah, there's a NuGet package called c1.win.printing, and this includes all of the printing and previewing components. There's the classic C1 print preview control, which has been around for a while. And one of our newer components is this C1 ribbon preview. You can get it in a dialog or in a separate component to build your own. And this is just going to be a complete, a much more richer experience for printing and previewing, as you're going to see here. It's also worth pointing out, look how all of the styles get printed. And then this is of course, an option. You can tell it to just print just the raw data, just the clean data. And in this print preview control, we can see the thumbnails, and it's actually raw text, or it's text. It's not just an image, so we can search the document. we could adjust things like the margins, and essentially this is working with a C1 print document in between. And of course, we could then print it, or we could actually just export it here to a variety of formats like PDF, Excel, images, rich text. But I would not recommend this approach for exporting to Excel, because FlexGrid does have more native support for Excel export. If you use this way to export to Excel, there's an extra transformation happening in the middle of going from FlexGrid to print document to Excel. Next, let me show you how we can just directly export FlexGrid to Excel without the print document in between. And for that, there's an extension method called SaveGrid or Save Excel. First, let me just go ahead and add another button here so that way we can show you the code for it. Yeah, SaveGrid lets you save it to like CSV and text, rich text. Save Excel directly to Excel, and it's a separate method because it has a lot more parameters and options, because you can say, do I want just the raw data? Do I want the styles? Do I want the fixed cells? Do I want the grouping? There's a ton of flags. That's what they're called. Yeah, flags that can be passed in here to the Excel file. And this, important to note, this is all in the c1.win.flexgrid import export. And this is going to bring in, some other, uses like an underlying Excel, C1 Excel library, which we didn't want to include in the core FlexGrid package because not everybody needs it. So here, now we can do export to Excel. Now, probably the best way to do this probably would have been wrapping this in like a save file dialog, but you probably saw my code. It was just saving it directly to the folder here of my project. So let's go ahead and open that in Excel, and let's see how good this Excel file looks. Look at this, it's beautiful. Even the owner draw cells get included. And like I said, there's all those different file flags that let you customize. In fact, I didn't include the grouping here, but we could even have the collapsible nodes could have been included here. Maybe you don't want the column headers, the row headers. Usually the row headers are pretty useless in here. I could have removed that. But that basically wraps up today's technical demo for today. If you want to learn more, you can visit the ComponentOne website. And on the FlexGrid product page, we have this beautiful Getting Started button at the top. That'll take you to all the resources you need to get started, including the NuGet package and the documentation and the samples. I'll give you a minute to enter some questions, but also if you've made it to the end of the webinar today, you are now eligible to win a free license to ComponentOne WinForms Edition. This includes 120 WinForms UI controls, including the FlexGrid that I showed today. You actually technically saw the ribbon today as well, and some of the input controls. We also have charts, docking, schedulers. So this giveaway is eligible for up to 1 hour after today's CodeClinic, and the winner will be notified by email within 14 days. Oops, sorry, I can keep that up there. We'll see now. Do we have any questions? Wait for see if any of these come in. All right, here we have a question. Is the custom cell height sizing per column possible? Example, column 3 has 10 rows, and I want to size cell 1, but not affect columns 1 and 2. That's a good question. Let me see here. There's definitely a row height property. Let me see if the rows collection has height as well. Yes, it looks like so. If you iterate the So FlexGrid.rows bracket, you can pass in the row number. There's a height property that says gets or sets the height of the row. So I believe you can do that. You can set different heights per row. Also, there's the auto size rows. So and you can also wrap the text. So yeah, so it definitely makes sense that FlexGrid can do, if you had wrapping text, the rows are going to be different heights. When changing multiple checkboxes in a grid before an edit event is fired for each checkbox, is there an event that starts before all edit and end all edit? Let's see. So there is a before edit event and after edit event. So I think that maybe answers your question. You're probably asking something more specific that probably doesn't answer your question, but I think the answer is yes. There is a before edit and after edit. And the nice thing though, if let's say that if you're using the built-in checkbox and you're not getting what you want, you could just, if I remember I showed the custom editor, you could just instantiate your own checkbox as the editor for a column, and then you have access to that checkbox's API. So you could listen to the checkbox's events to maybe get more precision. Any more questions? Okay, so both before edit and after edit occurs for each checkbox. Yeah, it sounds like you should be able to do whatever you want to do. You might just have to, like I said, work with a custom checkbox cell editor to get access to maybe more properties and features of the checkbox to handle that. And if you still can't do it, then that's probably a limitation of the checkbox maybe, or if you have any questions, of course, you could reach out to our support team and we could help look into the technical details a bit more in depth than I'm able to do right now. But thank you. Any other questions? All right, if we have no more questions, then I'd like to say thank you for attending. Have a good day. Bye.